Hey friend, welcome back to the Movies in a Bottle Beach, where we're checking out Ghost Rider. I have such a soft spot for the pre-MCU Marvel era, and this movie is like the most comic booky movie ever. When Ghost Rider gets going, he basically only plays by his own nonsensical rules, and it feels like he even knows he's a little overpowered half the time. But this movie was director Mark Steven Johnson's follow-up to Daredevil from 2003, and I'm curious to know how y'all think it compares, so let's roll film. This badass tale kicks off in the Wild West with a gravelly narrator telling us the legend of the Ghost Rider. Every generation is said to have their own rider, damned to roam the earth, collecting on the devil's deals. And legend says the rider was once tasked to go to San Venza to collect a contract that held 1,000 wicked souls. But the rider couldn't let the devil have that much power, so he outran Mephisto himself. We're still in flashback territory, but we jump ahead well over 100 years to when Johnny Blaze and his father, Barton Blaze, are wowing a circus crowd with awesome motorcycle tricks. However, right as their act is about ready to end, Johnny Blaze wants to impress his girlfriend, Roxanne, but he nearly wrecks while showing off. Barton saw his son nearly eat dirt earlier, so after the show, he tries to give his son some life advice by saying, "Roxy won't be there for you if you get hurt and end up in a wheelchair." He later adds that he needs to be mindful of his decisions because if you make your choices without thinking, your choices are making you. Ironically enough, Barton then starts coughing up a lung and lights up a cowboy killer before his son secretly throws the pack away. Then he asks his dad if he could ever take his prized motorcycle, Grace, out for a ride, but his dad gives him a hard time saying he isn't man enough yet. Roxanne then shows up hoping to see her boyfriend Johnny, so Barton reluctantly lets his son leave with her again. However, once Johnny gets done carving their names into the tree at their usual hangout spot, Roxanne has terrible news. Her dad is going to make her move away to live with her mom soon, but the pair can't have that, so they decide to ride away together tomorrow at noon. Besides, Barton doesn't really need help with the show anyways. When Johnny gets back home, he sees that his dad passed out while reminiscing through a scrapbook, but then he saw another pack of smoke, so he throws him out. But when he does, he saw something that his dad discarded. It was a letter with a cancer diagnosis. When Barton stirred awake, Johnny was so overwhelmed at the revelation that he rushed off to the garage to just go collect his thoughts. As Johnny was tinkering with his motorcycle, the tent suddenly felt like it was cold as ice as a stranger that we, the attentive audience, recognizes the devil, greets him in the entrance. And FYI, in order to avoid being too repetitive, I'm going to use the term Satan and the devil interchangeably, even though I know there's a lot of nuance regarding the devil, especially in Marvel Comics. Anywho, the devil offers Johnny to ride for him, which the kid respectfully declines, but then Satan observes how ill Barton appears to be, and specifically, just how terrible cancer is. During a lightning strike, Johnny saw a monster where the stranger's shadow should have been, so he knows something is a little off here, but he's willing to hear the man out whenever he says that he can make his dad healthy as a horse. And all it'll take is Johnny signing over his soul on a prepared contract, which he seems to do accidentally just by pricking his finger and leaving a drop of blood on the signature line. Johnny suddenly wakes up from what he decides must have been a crazy nightmare last night, only to see his dad inexplicably looking healthier than he has been in years. Barton even confirms as much, adding that he feels healthy as a horse for some reason. Perhaps that Faustian bargain wasn't just a dream. But with his newfound vitality, Barton excitedly tells his son an idea he's been rolling around for their act. Instead of a ring of fire, they can jump a helicopter. Hell yeah, brother. It's at this point Barton realizes that his son isn't ready for the show, and in fact, he has his bags packed to leave. Johnny tells his dad how he plans to ride away with Roxy soon because he wants more out of life than this, and his father is understandably crushed, but in his own way. He gives his son his blessing by letting him take his precious bike, Grace. Right afterwards, Barton goes to start his solo show, but Satan corrupts his part of the bargain by messing up Barton's jump, resulting in his untimely end. Before Johnny leaves, he hears a terrible sounding crash coming from where his dad was performing, so he rushes over there, only for Barton to pass away in his arms right on the stunt ramp. Feeling completely distraught, Johnny started racing over to the only person that he still has left, Roxanne, but whenever he approaches a four-way crossroads, the devil suddenly appeared and hurls the rider from his bike. After Satan tells Johnny Blaze that he's no good to him dead. It's totally on brand for the devil to be underhanded by writing out his contracts in Latin, but it makes sense because no one would sign it otherwise. Reddit user the Psycho Messiah posted a translation of the contract, and in a nutshell, it says that by the power of God, Johnny can command a Lord of Darkness, and they are bound together to do what Johnny desires. And I'll touch much more on it later, but the comic book origin is pretty similar, but way more badass in my opinion. The kid rises to his feet, pointing and accusing the monster of taking his father's life, which the devil doesn't refute. Satan confirms that he cured his dad's cancer, but he didn't want him to interfere with their new arrangement. Then the devil places his infernal hand on Johnny as he tells him he'll reappear whenever he needs him most, but in the meantime, forget all your friends, family, and love completely. And just as quickly as he appeared, the devil vanishes, presumably back down to Georgia looking for a soul to steal. But Johnny just lost his dad and he can't let Roxy befall the same fate, so instead of picking her up at noon, he just kept on driving, leaving her standing there alone under their tree as he rode off into the pouring rain. Skipping ahead about a decade later, Johnny was internally repeating his mantra, "You can't live in fear," before he gives a stadium of adoring fans the time of their lives by watching him jump over 20 semis. Righteous brother. As he hits the insane jump, Johnny closes his eyes and recalls signing the fateful pact, but then he crashes into the ground on the landing ramp hard. But whenever his friend Mac and the other crew members rush over, Johnny Blaze is fine and he's only worried about his bike. Whenever a reporter tries to get a scoop, he's reminded that Johnny doesn't do interviews. Back in the dorky sounding Team Blaze RV, the crew is having a good time celebrating another successful event. Johnny gives Mac a hard time about sucking at his video game, so they switch to TV, where Mac insists on watching coverage from tonight's jump. However, the mood gets serious after the news mentions how Johnny next plans on upping the ante by jumping an entire football field. Mac warns his friend that he's been lucky to survive this long, but Johnny privately suspects that it might be something other than luck. Almost on cue, fire starts raining down from the sky as the villainous, terrifying Blackheart emerges from the shadows. He goes to a desolate, ironically named Hell's Angels biker bar, and just like when the devil appeared before Johnny many moons ago, the air becomes cold as ice. Blackheart chuckles whenever the bouncer tells him that only angels are allowed, Hell's Angels members. But then the demon jabs his finger into the man's chest and it withers away the rest of his soul. Jumping back to our heroes, once they get to Blaze's house, Matt gives Johnny a hard time about not locking his lift, for having stacks of occult and religious books, and for eating fire-colored jelly beans instead of drinking alcohol like most dudes. Getting serious for a second though, Mac asks his friend why he's doing such a dangerous stunt on the anniversary of his father's death, but since Mac doesn't know about the deal with the devil, he doesn't understand Johnny Blaze's answer whenever he says he wants to prove that he's the one doing all the stunts. It's like a sort of imposter syndrome, but Johnny is still feeling guilty about his dad's death, so he asks Mac if he thinks people ever deserve a second chance, and ponders if he'll ever get one. But Mac sternly insists that Barton's accident wasn't Johnny's fault. After a moment of silence, Mac asks Johnny if he'll at least remove the cars from the football jump, and the stuntman promises he'll think about it. I got a few different bits of trivia to round up here. First, the game Mac was playing in the Team Blaze RV is called Crusty Demons, and it was made by Climax Studios in 2006. The same studio released the Ghost Rider video game a few days before this movie came out in 2007. Next, whenever Blackheart goes to the bar, the ironically named Hell's Angel bouncer was wearing a shirt with the X-Men character Abyss on it. And that definitely was intentional because Abyss is from an ancient, demonic-looking race of mutants called the Neophim, not Nephilim, and he is a living portal to the Brimstone dimension. And lastly, Johnny watches a cartoon when Mac was over, and it was Walt Disney's The Skeleton Dance from 1929. And I didn't even have to look that one up because my wife just knew it. Shout out to her. Blackheart made sure the rest of the patrons of the bar suffered the same fate as the bouncer, but once all the mere mortals were taking a long nap, his demonic allies would appear, with them controlling 3 of the 4 elements. Gressel is made from earth, Wallow from water, and Abigor from wind. And we'll see the fire element later, don't worry, but Blackheart has summoned them because he needs their help getting the contract of San Venza, which he'll use to take over Earth, and it's supposedly hidden in a graveyard nearby. Effectively, he's tired of waiting on Satan to hand over the reins, so he's just gonna take him by force. But their conspiracy is interrupted by none other than the devil himself. Blackheart deviously laughs at his father, that's right, his father, and reminds him that he has no power over him here on Earth because he's never fallen from heaven, unlike Satan did. And I personally don't understand where these rules are coming from, but we'll ride with it. Regardless, the devil counters by pointing out that his Ghost Rider still has powers, but Blackheart welcomes the chance to get even more revenge on his father by destroying his precious rider. Later on, Mac was unable to convince Johnny to back out of this insane football stadium jump, so the show will start soon. Johnny repeats his mantra, "You can't live in fear," before he starts to move through a sea of cameras to get to the jump, but then a voice cuts through the crowd, and after years of ignoring reporters, this one gets the great Johnny Blaze to stop in his tracks and do an interview. And that's because it turns out to be Roxanne, who went on to be an accomplished reporter. And while she's desperately trying to do a real interview with the reclusive star, He's just trying to catch up and asks if she got married, which she denies. But after that blunder of an interview, Roxanne walks away frustrated before the show even starts. As Matt gives his friend a few final notes on clearing this nigh impossible jump, we see that Johnny Blaze did remove the cars after all. But he wanted to honor his dad, so instead, he's gonna be jumping a bunch of helicopters. Johnny thinks that Roxanne must be on the highway at this point, so he races down the ramp and soars through the air. But this time, he doesn't think about his deal with the devil. Instead, he remembers Roxanne watching him from the circus, and it seems like he has a much different outcome whenever he's being motivated by love, so let's keep that in mind for the end of the movie. After cleanly landing on the ramp this time, Johnny stuns everyone by immediately taking off from the stadium to go catch up with Roxanne. And even though she thinks that she's far enough away to forget about Johnny again, that's going to be difficult because he races up on his motorcycle to her news van, asking to talk some more. She turns the daredevil down while he's narrowly avoiding oncoming traffic, but since she won't stop to chat, he speeds ahead and abruptly stops, forcing Roxy's van to stop too. Roxanne starts explaining at a mile a minute how she's moved on from him and she gets why he ran away after what happened with his dad. But Johnny wants to drop into things like they're still sweethearts and shuts her up with a kiss. Roxanne must have been feeling similarly though, because after thinking for a moment, she tells Johnny that he's taking her out to dinner tomorrow at 8 and not to be late. During filming, the world record distance for a motorcycle jump was 277 feet, set by Trigger Gum in May of 2005. On December 31st in 2007, Robbie Madison set a new record of 322 feet by essentially performing Johnny Blaze's goal-to-goal motorcycle jump in Las Vegas. He later do a whopping 391-foot jump for Red Bull in 2011. Also, behind the scenes, Nic Cage said that he was asked for his input on the scene where he flirts with Roxy on the highway, and he had just seen stunt driver Rob Jones do all kinds of acrobatic tricks on his bike, so Nick was so impressed, he wanted to incorporate that into romancing Roxanne. And I gotta say, it may be a little cheesy, but I dig it. Lastly, for that scene, they were allowed to film on a road that hadn't even been completely finished yet, or open to the public. The more you know. Predictably, 8 o'clock comes and goes, and the only company Roxy had was the waiters and her magic 8-ball. But as far as reasons go, Johnny had a pretty decent one. He was at home giving himself a pep talk in the mirror, claiming that Roxy was his sign that he has a second chance whenever he started to feel like he was burning up from the inside, and even stranger, his motorcycle Grace just vanished. After finding the bike outside, Johnny would be confronted by Satan once again, who would confirm his worst fears. He was indeed responsible for all the death-defying jumps, and now that his investment has grown, he's tasking Johnny Blaze with stopping Blackheart. Johnny basically tells the devil to get bent, but since he's already signed over his soul, Satan activates the rider's hidden powers by slamming his cane down. And once he does, all hell breaks loose and Johnny speeds upwards of 200 miles away while leaving a fiery trail in his wake, but notably, Grace's license plate was left along the way. Blackheart and his minions had gone to where a graveyard used to be and demanded to know where the graves were taken from a local who nervously tells them about St. Michael's Church. Nearby, Johnny Blaze was flung from his bike, and soon it felt like every fiber of his being was on fire. Suddenly, he could feel himself being consumed by a wildly powerful and insatiable force from hell until this generation's Ghost Rider would finally emerge, ready to vanquish evil, starting with Blackheart and his demons. The rider immediately confronts his overconfident adversary and does his signature point, promising to return Blackheart to hell. But as Johnny moves in, Abigor, the wind demon, delivers a powerful blow out of nowhere, sending the rider flying back and wrapping him in chains, extinguishing his flames even. But it turns out that's just the weapon the Ghost Rider needed, so he reignites his hellfire, imbuing the chain in the process, and then continues his mission. However, whenever Johnny steps into a puddle, Wallow, the water demon, holds him in place until Gressel, the earth demon, could smash him with a semi-truck. Gressel starts to walk away with the sweet taste of victory in his mouth, before that taste is immediately swapped out for hellfire by a knuckle sandwich delivered from the nigh unkillable rider. Feeling the effects of hellfire, Gressel realizes that he's in mortal danger and he cries out for help from his allies, but no one would come to his aid as the chains wrap around the demon, leaving him a smoldering pile of ash. Next, Ghost Rider summons his motorcycle with a whistle and then transforms it into the Hell Cycle, which was inspired by H.R. Giger, who was also responsible for designing the alien in Alien. And while I'm on a detour, I love the editing after the bike turns into the Hell Cycle because it looks like a horse to be reminiscent of the rider from the intro, but we quickly cut to Roxanne as she whinnies like a horse because she's just bored of waiting around for Johnny. Getting back on track, Johnny has one quick side quest to go on, and he saves this punk rock looking girl from being mugged, and he does so by using his greatest weapon, the penance stare. Ghost Rider points at the mugger, finding him guilty. Then he lifts the terrified man while telling him he's spilled the blood of the innocent, and now he'll have to pay by looking into Ghost Rider's molten eyes and feeling all the pain he's ever inflicted on others, all of which leaves the crook in a catatonic trance. From there, Johnny, almost on autopilot, rides to where his father, Barton Blaze, is buried, and then as the sun rises, he goes through this agonizing transformation to turn back into his regular self before our hero passes out. A rugged man with a gravelly voice casually greets him saying, "Morning, bonehead." Nic Cage is a huge fan of comics, and he really wanted to play Johnny Blaze specifically. In fact, he has a Ghost Rider tattoo that he had to have covered up by makeup to even play the character. But that's not all. When becoming an actor, he chose the last name Cage based on Marvel's Luke Cage. He also has a son named Kal-El, which is Superman's real Kryptonian name. And Cage himself almost played the Man of Steel in Tim Burton's Superman movie that never came to be. If you care to suffer through the end of the Flash movie, you can see a crappy CGI version of Nic Cage as Superman there. When Johnny Blaze wakes up, he feels thirstier than ever, and wouldn't you know it, someone left several glasses of water next to the superstar's bedside, and he quickly chugs them down. Outside, the old man we'll soon come to know as the caretaker was standing with his trusty shovel near the grave of someone named Carter Slade, when Johnny Blaze stumbles outside of the church looking for his bike. But the caretaker knows way more than meets the eye, because he not only tells Johnny Blaze where to find his bike, but he also ominously warns that last night wasn't a dream and that it will happen again. He continues by telling the superstar that he is now the Ghost Rider, and Johnny just wants to ride away from all this, but he stops dead when the old man brings up Johnny's deal with the devil. Lore dump inbound, y'all. The two go back to the church, and while the caretaker patches our hero up, he tells him how he's the Ghost Rider, tasked with Satan to return anyone that escapes from hell, but reassures him that he'll only transform at night in the presence of evil. Johnny recalls the deadly stare that he inflicted on the punk last night, and the caretaker informs him of the penance stare and how it's the Ghost Rider's greatest weapon. Johnny noticed that he had said riders in the conversation and asks if there have been any before him, and the old man tells the new Ghost Rider that there have been a few, but the last one was supposedly 150 years ago from San Venza, and here we learned what happened to that town. The devil basically treated them like pigs to the slaughter because he made deals with all of them until the whole town was corrupted and fell. Johnny wants to know what all this has to do with his mission of stopping Blackheart, but hearing that name gives the caretaker pause, and he warns Johnny that his foe, along with his elemental demon allies called the Hidden, are seriously dangerous. He advises Johnny to stay here on the hollow grounds of a church where it's safe, but Johnny has to go apologize to Roxy. Right before the writer leaves, though, the caretaker asks Johnny what he got from his fateful deal, and Johnny vaguely answers, heartache. And that theme continues whenever he drives back to the scene of last night's incident where Roxanne would predictably be on scene reporting. Once she wraps up interviewing Ghost Rider's first adoring fan, Johnny apologizes for standing her up, but Roxy is all out of patience and regrets even giving him another chance, so she drives off, leaving Johnny at a loss for words. And unfortunately, just a stone's throw away, a cop finds Johnny's license plate that flung off of Grace whenever he sped after Blackheart. Shout out to my wife again for noticing that the girl Roxanne was interviewing was Rebel Wilson. It turns out this was her American film debut. And speaking of Roxy, Eva Mendes took this role without even having a script. Director Mark Steven Johnson promised to make a great movie that she'd enjoy being a part of. And obviously, Mendes did roll the dice on him, but she did confirm that she had a great time. Johnson then told a quintessentially 2000 story whenever he said that Eva Mendes was always excited to bring her iPod to set and show everyone her cool songs. How charming. Johnny would go on to spend his night poring over religious texts with newfound purpose until he eventually stumbled on a passage describing how Nephilim are angels that descended from heaven into the elements here on earth, but they're not to be confused with the Hidden. But reading on, Johnny learns how man can control their possessing spirit if they concentrate hard enough on the fire element that lies within them. And putting it to the test, Johnny is indeed able to conjure fire and even throw a fireball. Surprisingly, Roxanne shows up unannounced because she felt terrible about her harsh words earlier, and she knew she'd regret it if that was the last thing she ever said to Johnny. However, Roxanne gets distracted once she notices all the memorabilia from the good old days scattered around, and she even finds photos from back when they were sweethearts. Then Roxy is the one that makes a move on the superstar by moving in for a fiery kiss, but Johnny definitely is a bonehead here because he turns Roxy down. After getting so many mixed signals, Roxanne wants to know what the hell's really going on here, and reluctantly, Johnny tells her all about how he's the Ghost Rider and how it's dangerous for her to be around him. And yeah, it goes about as well as you'd expect, and she leaves seemingly for good, thinking that Johnny is either crazy or just blatantly lying to her. But right after she drives off, the police move in and arrest Johnny Blaze for being the man associated with the license plate that they found earlier at the crime scene. At the station, the cops now think that the people Blackheart has been offing was Johnny, but the police have about as much luck talking to him as reporters do, because even though they have all kinds of evidence that the superstar is definitely involved, he simply just denies everything. With their investigation going nowhere fast, the cops decide to hold Johnny in jail overnight, but we, the attentive audience, know that that's a terrible idea because the writer comes out once he's surrounded by evil, and just as predicted, once he's in a cell with a bunch of criminals, they all want a piece of the mega famous superstar and they jump him, so the Ghost Rider emerges, sending all the crooks flying. Johnny then goes to leave, but pauses and looks back at the only one that tried to defend him and declares him innocent, before melting the jail bars and riding away on his loyal motorcycle that's already waiting outside. Two things real quick. Whenever Ghost Rider was in jail, he steals the jacket from somebody, but I guess it's okay for Ghost Rider to steal if it's from a criminal already? I don't know. But more interestingly, I want you to keep tabs on Ghost Rider's bike because it seems like it may have a mind of its own, the way it responded to Ghost Rider's whistle earlier and how it was already waiting here for him outside. But we're going to touch on all that later. Tons of police would proceed to follow Ghost Rider until they seemingly have him trapped on top of a bridge. However, these guys don't realize that their suspect isn't bound by the laws of physics, and he just laughs at the police as he rides away from them on top of the river. Afterwards, Abigor is ordered by Blackheart to take out the rider, so he lures him down a dead-end alley before he rockets up a skyscraper. The cop following the rider is again reminded how he isn't playing by our rules, and then Johnny casually starts driving up the building. And coincidentally, Roxy was actually staying nearby, and whenever she looked out her window, she saw all this happening outside and started to think that maybe Johnny Blaze wasn't so crazy after all. But more importantly, Ghost Rider caught up with Abigor on top of the building and naturally started taking swings at him with his chain, but they have no effect since he's made of wind, so Johnny ignites it with his hellfire. The demon laughs, taunting our hero that he can't hit the wind, but too late does Abigor realize that the rider has cleverly turned his chain into a fiery vortex that he couldn't escape. That's 2 down and 2 to go. Johnny again says screw the rules, and he rides his bike down the skyscraper where Roxanne would be waiting amongst the crowd, not to cover the news like usual, but instead to see what her beloved Johnny has become. However, the cops just see a flaming skeleton walking towards them, so they open fire, causing him to lash out and flee. And it's worth mentioning that the producer commentary track really insightfully captures the feeling of the scene whenever they describe it as a Beauty and the Beast type of moment. Director Mark Steven Johnson understood that the character and mythology of Ghost Rider was inherently dark, so he allowed Nic Cage to do a lot of improv to lighten up the movie, and I wholeheartedly agree with his reasoning, citing that the best horror movies blend comedy with scares because the release laughter gives you makes the scares all that more shocking. However, since this movie is a Marvel title, the movie mostly does the reverse, where it's primarily comedic and cheesy, but with the occasional scare. And I love how unapologetically comic booky this movie is, but they definitely screwed up somewhere along the lines by being one of the very few Marvel movies, along with Blade, to not do a Stan Lee cameo. During all that commotion, Blackheart was busy elsewhere, following up on that lead about St. Michael's Church that he got right before his first encounter with the Ghost Rider. And sadly, it does not go well for the priest there, so he tells Blackheart about the caretaker that's supposedly watching over the contract. We catch back up with our hero after the sun has risen and he's returned to his normal self, but he goes back to the caretaker who tells him that this isn't going to end until he gets the job done. Later, the old man goes on to tell him about that Carter Slade grave he was hanging around earlier. Supposedly, he was an honorable Texas Ranger that got a little too greedy while waiting on the hangman, and he made a deal with the devil for his freedom. He then goes on to tell Johnny about the legend of San Venza from the intro and how that legendary writer made sure Mephistopheles wouldn't get that all-powerful contract. Legend also says the contract was buried with Carter Slade, and the caretaker isn't sure if that part's true or not, but what he does know is that Blackheart is coming to find out, and then he warns Johnny Blaze that the demon will exploit anyone Johnny loves to get closer to that contract. Johnny immediately thinks of Roxanne, and he races away, but he might be too late. I had to tap out from the coat, I got too hot, but let's talk about the comics for a second, shall we? The backstory is similar enough, but the movie streamlines things a little bit. For example, in the comics, Johnny's dad dies while doing a stunt, so he goes off to live with a friend named Crash, who gets sick and is the one Johnny does the deal for. Whereas in the movie, Crash's character is more or less just rolled up into Barton's. And I almost didn't share this bit with you, But in the comics, Roxanne is Johnny's adoptive half-sister. Yikes. Anywho, they allude to this in the movie, but in Marvel Comics, it's very well known that the tricksy demon Mephisto more or less poses as the Christian devil and is the one who empowers the Ghost Rider by possessing him with the ancient rebellious demon spirit called Zarathos, the Spirit of Vengeance. And I'm glossing over a ton for time, but if you like Ghost Rider, there's a ton of lore to sink your chattering teeth into. Meanwhile, Roxy had gone to Johnny's house looking for him, but instead she found Mac. Mac astutely points out that Team Blaze was riding the gravy train on biscuit wheels before she showed back up, and now things are all sorts of crazy. But Roxy barely knows what's going on herself, and she can't even begin to explain it to Mac, so instead she just begs for his help on any clues, so together they start reading all the religious texts that Johnny was studying. And tragically, as predicted, Blackheart did pay the caretaker a visit after Johnny left him alone, and the demon even being on hollow ground kinda catches the old man off guard, but Blackheart brags that he has all of his dad's powers with none of his weaknesses, and unsurprisingly, the grizzled caretaker proves to be resilient against the demon's violent interrogations, and he doesn't give up anything about the contract or the Ghost Rider. Realizing that he has to change his strategy, Blackheart then sets his sights on Roxanne to draw out his rival. Blackheart then uses his dark magic to appear at Johnny so he can use Roxy as bait, and sadly, Mac gets collateral damage in the process. But our hero arrives home shortly after, only to fall for Blackheart's ambush as he leaps from the shadows. However, Johnny immediately turns into the Ghost Rider and he goes for the penance stare, which has absolutely no effect because Blackheart literally doesn't have a soul to reverse all of his sins onto. The demon then effortlessly throws the Ghost Rider down to the ground so hard that he reverts back to Johnny, and Blackheart gives him an ultimatum. Get the contract from the caretaker and deliver it to him at San Venza, or else Roxanne isn't gonna make it. Of course, our hero races back to the caretaker asking him for the contract, but he remains silent. Only when Johnny almost starts digging up Carter Slade's grave does the old man confess that it's not in that grave, or any grave. He then smashes his trusty shovel to reveal that it's ingeniously been hidden inside the handle this whole time. And Johnny has no other choice, so he begs the caretaker to entrust him with the contract, sincerely explaining that the devil has his soul, but not his spirit. Then after also considering Johnny's earlier comment about selling his soul for heartbreak, the caretaker tells our hero that anyone who sells his soul for love can change the world. He then adds that since Johnny made the deal with the devil for the right reasons, he has God on his side and that makes him dangerous. Then after so many years of keeping the contract safe, the caretaker hands it over and tells the Ghost Rider that San Venza is over 500 miles away, and coyly says that we better get moving before he whistles for his loyal steed that emerges from the fog. The caretaker, or should I say Carter Slade, tells our hero that he has one last ride in him and that he and his horse are engulfed with hellfire as they transform into the fabled Ghost Rider from the legend. We then get the undeniably coolest shot of the entire movie whenever both Ghost Riders from past and present race neck and neck, leaving scorching trails behind them through the desert. But all good things must come to an end. After reaching the outskirts of San Venza, Carter Slade metaphorically passes the torch by passing Johnny his lever-action Model 1887 shotgun. The Phantom Rider confesses that he only had enough strength for this last ride, and then after spending lifetimes trying to right his wrongs, the caretaker thanks his friend and hopes that the big guy upstairs sees fit to give him a second chance at whatever comes next, before he rides off and vanishes into the distance. According to IMDb and a Marvel fandom wiki, the comic book version of the caretaker was actually based on Sam Elliott, who of course plays him here, and in the comics, Carter Slade is known as the Phantom Rider, and his horse's name is Banshee, so there you go. And this one isn't really comic book related, but there's an homage to David Mann's totally unrelated painting, also called Ghost Rider, when Johnny and the caretaker ride off to San Venza. That's when they're racing neck and neck. Lastly, in the director's commentary, Mark Steven Johnson said that they originally planned for the caretaker's horse to be summoned from Carter Slade's grave, but they couldn't really find a way to achieve that shot, so they had to scrap it. So I guess just use your imagination. As Johnny makes his way to the ghost town, Blackheart comments to his final ally, Wallow, that daylight is approaching, and then he orders him to go slow down the Ghost Rider. And Wallow is definitely aware that fighting Ghost Riders is bad for his health, but he follows the command regardless, and once our hero was carefully trying to drive around a foggy and murky lake, the demon pulls him underwater. Wallow slowly drags Johnny Blaze lower and lower into the depths, and he fights back every second of the struggle, but tragically, once all hope seems lost, Johnny Blaze turns into the Ghost Rider, who, remember, only operates by his own comic book rules, and then he grabs the water demon, holding him in place until the rider's hellfire totally incinerates him. And remember earlier when I said we were going to revisit Johnny's motorcycle having a mind of its own later? Well, when Johnny emerges from the lake, his bike flickers its headlight and revs its engine, and apparently this is the only visual element left of a scrapped idea to give the Hell Cycle a personality kinda like Kit from Knight Rider. And they correctly assumed this was too silly for this movie's tone and mostly scrapped the idea. But enough trivia, back to the main quest. Johnny rides his bike into town looking to settle things with the big bad Blackheart, and as expected, he has Roxanne hostage. And tactically, Johnny won't hand over the contract until he lets Roxy go, so he tosses her aside, but when Blackheart tries to grab the contract of San Venza, Johnny Blaze turns into the Ghost Rider. However, even with both his chain and Model 1887, the rider kinda gets whooped, I'm not gonna lie. But making things even worse, the sun is starting to rise, partially bathing the town in sunlight. Then despite all of Johnny's efforts, the demon finally succeeds in his own quest of obtaining the infernal contract, and now he has the power of 1,000 wicked souls to make hell on earth a reality. Following Blackheart's dark baptism, he awakens reborn as Legion, which is a reference to Mark 5-9, where another collection of demons in a single host was also called, that's right, you guessed it, Legion. Sorry for saying his name weird earlier. That's how Legion says it in the movie, and I just get really into these recordings sometimes. Roxanne finally gets up and she wonders why Johnny is risking it all to stop this guy, and the writer mutters, he's the only one that can walk in both worlds, so he has to stop him. Quickly, the writer sends Roxanne away and he grabs his gently used boomstick and he starts blasting, but sadly, it's next to useless. The all-powerful demon easily tosses Johnny Blaze into a church, where he painstakingly tries to crawl into the shadows so he can transform and maybe stand some sort of chance here, but it's no use. Legion goes to end his father's most precious creation, but Roxanne comes in clutch with a Model 1887 and is able to free Johnny. She then tosses Johnny Blaze the gun and he holds it into the shadows and transforms it into the Phantom Rider's weapon and it obliterates Legion. Hell yeah, thanks Caretaker. But then Johnny watches as all the damned souls start amalgamating together to reconstitute Legion, and then it dawns on Johnny that this isn't a battle of strength anymore, it's about strategy. And then the Ghost Rider finally puts the bad guy in checkmate by stepping forward and causing Legion to look into his smoldering eyes and suffer the penance stare. Inconceivable terror would course through Legion as he realized that instead of having no soul like before, he now is host to 1,000 of the most wicked souls that ever walked the earth, and he has to endure every misdeed they ever committed reflected back on his multitude of evil souls. Blackheart/Legion was left in a catatonic state, but no one feels bad for that jerk, so Roxanne runs over to check on the Ghost Rider, who recoils, calling himself a monster. But she embraces him anyways and touches Johnny through the fire, causing him to revert back to the face that Roxy knows and loves. But we aren't done just yet. Mephistopheles, or the devil, or Satan, whatever you want to call him, he returns to reclaim the power of the Ghost Rider because Johnny has settled his end of the bargain and he definitely sent the bad guys back to hell. But Johnny Blaze continues the legacy set forth by his predecessor, and he denies the devil by holding on to the curse of the Ghost Rider, vowing to use the spirit of vengeance against evil and to fight fire with fire. Then the devil lets out a furious roar, then disappears, taking Blackheart with him. And now we close this journey by a familiar tree on a hill where Johnny and Roxanne used to meet as young sweethearts. They're musing on Barton's old adage that if you don't make a choice, the choice makes you, and Roxy wonders why all of Johnny's choices kept them apart. But while the superhero wishes that things could be different, Roxanne knows that this was who he's meant to be, and that he finally got that second chance he's always wanted. And then they share a passionate kiss next to the carving on the weather tree reading, J and R forever. I feel like my wife unintentionally co-wrote this episode with me, but while watching this movie with her to prepare for this video, she pointed out how the end of this movie is basically the same ending as Blade, and I couldn't unsee it. The souls flying around into the big bad are nearly identical, and the hero literally says that he's the only one that can walk in both worlds. Sound familiar? And it doesn't really help the fact that Donald Logue, who plays Quinn in Blade, is also running around in this movie. But the real smoking gun for her theory was in the credits, whenever we saw that David S. Goyer was an executive producer for this movie because he's the one that wrote Blade. Pretty derivative, fellas, but still thoroughly enjoyable. Let me know what you thought of the director's second crack at a Marvel movie after his version of Daredevil in 2003, but until next week, y'all be good.